On episode 2096 of the Joe Rogan Experience, Joe Rogan would interview a man called Sheldon Johnson, but little did Baldy in the basement know that 38 days later, he would get arrested and charged with murder. It was the 1st of February of 2024, and a reoccurring guest, Josh Dubin, who was a lawyer that worked with wrongfully convicted felons and had already been on the JRE other times where he would bring on wrongfully convicted people.
We're here to get the word out about wrongful convictions.
Only this time it was different. Sheldon Johnson wasn't wrongfully convicted.
I figured we'd do something a little bit different. Typically, the person sitting to my right is someone that was wrongfully convicted. So I don't want to bury the headline. Sheldon is guilty.
At the time of doing this podcast, Sheldon had only been released for a year after doing a 25-year sentence, and the point of this podcast was to show that he had served way too much time for the crimes he had committed.
It's pretty astounding how he was treated by the system. I think that there's a real interesting twist, another miracle sitting to my right, just like a marvelous human being who was basically told by a judge, by an African-American judge, that you don't matter for a crime in which the victim received 2 stitches on a second offense, his first offense being a gun possession charge.
In 1975, Sheldon Johnson grew up in a poverty-stricken housing section of Harlem, New York City, and a lot of his family had been in and out of prison, and he was indoctrinated into the gang life at a very young age.
I'm also a product of intergenerational incarceration. My father was incarcerated. He did about 15 years. I was incarcerated. My grandfather was incarcerated. My great-grandfather was a slave. And my son killed somebody when he was 12 years old.
And I'm not gonna lie, something very odd is that a lot of his family were deaf.
My mother's deaf, my father's deaf, my sister's deaf, my aunt is deaf. I grew up in a deaf household.
I don't know about you, but when he said that shit caught me off guard. Sheldon had gotten into gang-related things at the age of 12 and, in his own words, started to move up the ranks. He began to rack up charges, small ones in comparison to now, of course. But at the age of 21 is where it would all start to go downhill. He committed 2 armed robberies and received a sentence of 50 years, which Sheldon and Josh would argue was unfair for the crime he committed. And apparently it was right after being in prison when he realized he needed to turn his life around. He began a journal about hope, change, and reform, and in an entry titled "A Letter to My Younger Self," he would go on to say, "Just because you are surrounded by violence does not mean that violence is the way to solve your problems. Sheldon, 2 wrongs do not make a right. Violence only begets. Learn how to respond and not react." Sheldon said he spent years educating himself. He would go on to write, "I have grown dramatically in these 14 years when I could have easily withered away." He actually became such a model inmate that BuzzFeed would advocate for his release in 2016, and as a result of good behavior, Sheldon had been released after serving 25 years of a 50-year sentence, appearing in a podcast called Success After Lockdown, where he said he would never go back to prison.
I'm reflecting, I'm saying to myself like, yo, I can't spend the next 50 years like this.
And 1 month later after that podcast, he would go to do his notorious podcast on the Joe Rogan Experience. He even began working for the Queen's Defenders, helping troubled youth who fall into bad paths. He even expressed his disbelief of being released after 25 years, which anyone should be able to see how insane that must feel like.
I said, I just came from the bowels of hell. Spending 25 years in prison, and now I'm in the sky above the clouds in the heavens.
Of course, neither Josh Dubin nor Joe Rogan expected what was about to happen 38 days later after the podcast. Sheldon was childhood friends with a man named Colin Small, and this is where the story gets twisted. They both had served 10 years in prison together, and after Sheldon's release, Colin Small was helping Johnson get back on the right path. However, there must have been a falling out because on the 6th of March 2024, police received a phone call from a tenant who lived in New York claiming to have heard 2 gunshots from Colin's apartment, and even more sinister, as well as a voice begging, "Please don't, I have a family."
A man found dismembered inside an apartment. Now today, police arrested a man named Sheldon Johnson. He is a criminal justice activist, and he boasted about turning his life around after getting out of prison as recently as going on shows like the Joe Rogan podcast.
The police went as fast as possible, and when they got there, they found Sheldon at Colin's place with half of his body dismembered and half of his body at Sheldon's house.
But police say this is also him, carrying cleaning supplies and a full black garbage bag in and out of this building. When police entered the apartment, they found a man's torso and a foot inside a bin. Law enforcement sources say after seeing Johnson on surveillance footage, they searched his apartment and found the victim's legs, arms, and head.
They would also find concrete and many other things where he intended to cover it up. CCTV showed Sheldon exiting and entering in the most goofy-ass disguises, like if it was straight out of a cartoon. Sheldon was arrested and charged with murder, while the whole time he was screaming, "I'm innocent." Joe Rogan and Josh Dubin have both already came out publicly to talk about it.
We had a very unfortunate incident happen after the podcast, about a month later.
Yeah.
The gentleman beheaded somebody.
Allegedly, yes.
And although I don't think Joe Rogan has any blame, of course, that's just my opinion, the credibility of Josh Dubin from the audience's perspective will definitely forever be tainted. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, thank you, and peace.